next speech will be given by Dr. Azevedo. He has a master on cardiovascular rehabilitation. Nelson is a very kind person, big professional, and a point of reference. He will talk about the sympathetic paradox and the muscle reflex system. Thank you.
Life. What's life for you? What does life represent for you? Love? Connection? Balance? Adaptation? Because life is also adaptation. The one that does not adapt will die. And that is possible because we have an autonomic nervous system. And as you all know, the autonomic nervous system is made up of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems. As our previous speakers have very clearly stated, we shouldn't forget either the enteric system, as Raquel said. The parasympathetic is in charge of rest and digestion or recovery, and the sympathetic nervous system is in charge of action, movement. And also, movement becomes art. Dancing is art, or playing soccer is art. And movement is art, but it has its own patterns. Each and every one of you has his or her own individual patterns that are unique to them. And that is important because those patterns create a network, a wonderful neural network that connects all muscles, and almost every movement is controlled independently, almost autonomically or automatically by that magnificent network that connects it connects us all, and that connection also serves to connect ourselves with ourselves or with other people. Whenever we hug someone, we are connecting to some extent with that other person. And that connection changes when we go into survival mode. Has anyone here at some point been in a survival mode? Have you ever been? Yeah, I've been there many times. Our movement changes in those situations. And it acquires, the limbic system acquires a special role, a very small structure, which is 3 centimeters in diameter, which is the amygdala. It is triggered, it is activated in order to defend us. And when we look at something that frightens us, that generates fear in us, that is going to cause us harm, like, for example, a cobra. What is that? We say, wow, that's a cobra, that's a snake. Do you like cobra? But if that something that is going to damage us is permanent, for example, a beautiful cat can be disgusting, or it can frighten us, or our colleague, our girlfriend, or something, that everything becomes negative because there are neural changes. Then we go into fight or flight mode. Many of us, and also our patients, stay in the fight or flight mode. They have to defend themselves constantly, or I have to defend myself. And that has a neural reflection. And then the sympathetic nervous system is activated. The motor activity is enabled, and we have lower pain threshold or higher pain threshold. You will perceive less pain. Or the PAC, our hypothalamus, as Eduardo Zamorano has said, also steps back, and then noradrenaline is going to come in and will regulate pain. And it also isolates our bodily representation, which is also extremely important in the perpetuation of neural patterns of ourselves and of our body. But that fight or flight mode is not the only defense mechanism. Tonic immobility is also very important. When you, for example, in the weekend, how many of you like to stay in the sofa, sitting in the sofa, relaxing and doing nothing? Many of you will probably. You doing that many times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, is a nuanced defense mechanism. When I stay like that, as many of you, in some way, in a covered manner, I'm defending myself. Let's put a challenge. Just do not cross your legs or your arms. Just open up yourselves. What do you feel? You feel more vulnerable, less protected? What do you feel? It feels weird. And at home, what do you feel when you don't cross your legs or your arms? Because that has a neural expression that is going to inhibit the motor activity. And the sympathetic action will decrease, and it also decreases pain. It is a defense mechanism in the end. But there is something which is important, and that stays both in tonic immobility and in fight or flight mode, which is an increase of muscle tone. But the deep muscles, when I'm going to cross my legs, there are deep muscles that do that. The tonic muscles that stay tense. How many of your patients come to your practice and they say, I always feel tense? How many of you? All of them, probably all of them. They are in a defense mode, but they want to drop, and they can't because we have patterns that perpetuate those patterns. And there's a muscular activity, muscle activity, what we call muscle sympathetic nerve activity, which will preserve that constant activity in the heart, in the skeletal muscles, in the arteries, and it is measured through an electric activity, through microneurography. That is an electrical activity. By increasing the muscle, it also increases the arteries, both of them at the same time. There is higher muscle tension, but more arterial pressure as well at the same time. And that is the basis of the increase of heart rate. And also in the muscles, the same happens. The regulation of the muscle tone is guaranteed by the sympathetic activity. But not only the muscle tone, also the connection of the motor nerve is fundamental. It is a fundamental sympathetic activity. That is one of the studies that encouraged me to provide tools to control and work on the autonomic nervous system, because I had that in mind. I had the idea that the nerve, motor, muscle, there was a sympathetic and autonomic nervous network that regulated the motor activity. That is extremely important because we are talking about different types of connections. As soon as a motor nerve connects to some tissue, the sympathetic nervous system is going to create a synapses, a connection, but not only one, but a whole network of them. You not only have a connection, but that connection becomes very important because it will be the basis of the sustained reflexes. When your patients are tense for a long period of time, if they are subjected to permanent stress, that reflex is kept longer, and you tell them, relax, relax, and they don't know how to do that. Because peripherally and centrally, those changes are becoming perpetuated because of that activity. And that's important because when the muscles are too tense, because of the increase in of sympathetic activity, the arteries receive the same information. I'm going to increase the tension, the muscle tension, because of the sympathetic system, but also the arterial system. And arteries are going close to the nerves, close to the muscle, sorry. And so the muscle exerts direct pressure on the artery. That's a vicious cycle. By increasing ischemia, you increase the sympathetic pressure and the blood pressure, and then it increases the tension of the muscles in turn. And so it's a vicious circle. And then the lower limbs, which are our second heart, more tension, more pressure. And that is going to lead to a peripheral arteriopathy, and that has no end. That's a problem that has no end. And it is also important in the heart, for example, in any cardiac heart failure, for example, the more you increase the sympathetic activity, the more serious the compromise of that heart failure is going to be. And also the risk of death, which will increase in proportion to the increase of the sympathetic activity, the reflex sympathetic activity. That's very important because we also speak about pain, and we all, in one way or another, deal with pain, either chronic or acute. And for example, those people that have chronic pain, the increase of the sympathetic reflex activity is quite apparent. There are many structures involved. There are two structures. One is the reticular formation, the locus coeruleus, which has in the vagus nerve has a very important structure. We all speak about the vagus, which is going to modulate, and the muscle, the vascularization is going to be altered. It increases the attention on one and the other. But something very important happens, which is the motor control. We are talking about muscles, but muscles have a motor control, and part of that motor control is guaranteed by a very important structure, which is the neuromuscle spindle. There's a histological evidence of the parasympathetic activity in the muscle control. So part of the control, part of the movement is I'm going to stay like this and I'm not going to fall because there are some control connections between the sympathetic system, which controls that muscle spindle, which is extremely important for controlling the muscle tone. And that in the 19th century, Ruffini, Angelo Ruffini, I guess that we all in one way or another study Ruffini because of the Ruffini corpuscles, which he was a neuroscientist which studied the neural receptors. And when he studied, he proposed a hypothesis. Here, there has to be a sympathetic innervation here. There has to be a sympathetic innervation. He didn't have any evidence, but now, today, science has provided that evidence that he was looking for, and he's a contemporary of Ramon y Cajal, that you know very well. It is important, but also it has an impact on sleep. For example, the tongue is a muscle, and it is affected by the sympathetic activity, the reflex sympathetic activity. For example, when we are sleeping, when the REM phase starts, there is a very there's a sympathetic activity which is very similar to that when you are awake. Many of the sudden death episodes happen in a chronic apnea activity because of the increase of the reflex sympathetic activity. The tongue and all the muscles become entangled. How many of you have patients with an objective sleep apnea? And they say always, I'm very tired, everything is aching, not just because of the apnea, it is also the muscle tension that affects everything. Hence, this is a vicious cycle. A vicious cycle that affects everything. Now I am going to make a very dangerous experiment. This is a very dangerous experiment. My recommendation is that you close your ears. Yeah, it's better. In my hand, in my left hand, I have the muscles, and in my right, I have the blood pressure. What happens when I increase the sympathetic activity in the muscle? What do the muscles do? They exert pressure. I cannot leave air go out, but in my right hand, I have the sympathetic activity that is going to increase blood pressure. So I'm going to pressure both hands. Nothing is going to come out of here. So I need to do something. No. No. No, I have to release. Just have to release it. I have to release, to break down the chains, the currents. How do I do that? With microcurrents. Today, we know that microcurrents can influence or can create huge alterations in every system in the body, and in particular in the muscle system, which improves considerably in terms of muscle efficiency, in particular in mitochondria, which are the energy, the power plants of the cells. You can improve the creation of ATP, and it also improves the vascular flow and muscle relaxation as well. Everything improves. But here there's a problem. There's a local action. You act locally. When we look at the devices that exist, they act locally. And when we do something locally, we have consequences everywhere. When we do something locally, it is reflected everywhere. But what happens is that it has different effects in different parts of the body. And that is not controlled. I used to have a problem when I was treating a knee. The person said, okay, now I have a pain in my shoulder. What happened? It was the same expression, but differently, different manifestation, different manifestation. So I needed something to control all that, something that would help me consider everything as a whole. And I remember when I go to sleep somewhere, and when you have a short blanket, either you cover your shoulders and then the feet are not covered, or you cover your feet and then the shoulders are not covered. So I needed something that was wider, more extensive, and that's my clinical need. And so internet, I needed to look for something that can complete that jigsaw puzzle, that completes the whole. And I discovered Nesa. That's my need today. That is becoming wider and wider, and that addresses the system as a whole. As Raquel said, the system as a whole, and Fabiola also said that. Eduardo Zamorano. This is a complete system, and we have to deal with everything. And that's the only way in which we will guarantee that what I did to one hand or to a foot or another hand, that could affect everything, that we didn't leave anything aside. As Aristotle said, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. We need a holistic approach, and that is extremely important. And when we start to deal with a disease, it's like an orchestra. We have the conductor that can be distracted, and then the musicians are out of tune. So we have to change that. We need to change the conductor so that the orchestra is in tune. And we do that through Nesa. And we can use someone that I like very much. Who knows Hans Zimmer? I guess that the Germans will know him. Do you like Hans Zimmer? I love it. Love him. And who does not like good music? We have excellent music with Silvia. It is important. Health, full health, is made up of harmony, of beauty. Harmony and beauty. That's what it is all about. And when we think about microcurrents, Nesa microcurrents, we think about something like music, like a frequency, like vibration. And that is what Nesa does with its microcurrents in the organism. It connects everything. It is pure music. And Nikola Tesla said, if you want to understand the secrets of the universe, you have to think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. It is like music. That is the secret of the universe and the secret to life. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nelson, for your excellent presentation. It is a very interesting topic. In fact, there are several questions for you. I'm going to start. To what extent the autonomic nervous system is the one that increases muscle tone, or is it the muscle tone that increases the sympathetic tonic balance or equilibrium? That's a good question. There are several structures that modulate the muscle tone. The autonomic nervous system, just some time ago, was not part of the equation. There is a reticular formation, the cerebellum. There are many different structures that are going to regulate the tone. But we didn't know that the sympathetic system acted directly on that. So we needed to change my perspective. So that change, the muscle tone is determined by the sympathetic, but if we modulate the tone, it also will cause alterations in the autonomic nervous system. So the tone impacts the autonomic, and the autonomic impacts the tone. So it is a cycle as well. It is very dynamic. One affects and influences the other, the tone and the autonomic nervous system. I don't know if I've answered your question. Yeah, I think so. Yes. Okay. Thanks. Do you think that there's a relationship between the activity of the autonomic nervous system and the usual cramps that you feel in your legs? I don't have the evidence, but I think there is a relationship because it has a pattern. There's a sequence, a pattern of sequence, and it is a reflex activity. And so when we think about a reflex activity, we have to think about the autonomic control that is normally associated to that. Very, very interesting what you said about apnea. Are apneas treated with Nesa neuromodulation that have had an improvement? Are there any clinical cases? Well, we have to look at a multidisciplinary perspective. It is not just an autonomic or reflex activity, but it does help by lowering the reflex activity. That, of course, you cannot do it only with this, but there are increases and improvements of sleep in general and also muscle relaxation. People that take Nesa normally are less pain, they feel less pain, and they are less fatigued, not so tired. But of course, you have to look at cardiology, epidemiology. You have to take a wider perspective, of course, in order to answer that question properly. There are two questions that are very similar here. I'm going to ask both of them together. This reflex, this muscle reflex, which is so important, do you think that you have to take that into account in order to provide treatments in the clinic setting? And how do you apply that in the clinic setting with neuromodulation? Well, first of all, I have to say that before working with Nesa, I've worked with systems, that autonomic, reflex autonomic modulation. And after getting to know the autonomic at Nesa, it has given me more. I can get deeper. So what I do today is to cross reflex modulation autonomic, because one is depending on the other, and together with Nesa. Yes, thanks very much. Let's continue. You've spoken about the fight or flight, that strategy. Do you think that we can train that strategy of fight or flight? Yes, I do think. Fight or flight is a motor expression. And that motor expression nurtures the brain structures, but the brain also feeds the peripheral neuromuscle structures. How can we change the periphery in order to change our minds? If I'm like this all the time, we can say whatever. Yeah, lower your shoulders, but I'm going to say in 5 seconds, the same will happen. So then 5 seconds, lower your shoulders. And then after 5 seconds, they're going to stay like this, and you have to keep changing and changing and changing. That's one way. Another one is, as Eduardo Zamorano said, through breathing. Change the pattern of breathing, and that will change your attitude, the defense attitude, because when we are in fight or flight, we are blocking breathing, and that we are blocking the fight or flight mode. So motor conscience is very important, and then there's the insula, which is and the amygdala, which are important, and the vagus. Those are very interesting and very important structures that are extremely important to bear in mind, of course. Next question, medication that affects or interferes in that autonomic nervous system or central nervous systems, all the anxiolytics, antidepressants, and so on, inhibitory ones. Does it affect the system? Well, there are studies that say that the medicines, statins, for example, lower the sympathetic reflex activity, but they say that only in the most serious and most complex cases, not everywhere. Those that do not have that evidence of the augmented or increased regulatory activity, they don't see so many changes, but there is something which is very important. That's why reflex systems are very important. We have the tendency to look at the communication and mitigation. But if you are on the medication, yeah, they will go away. But when you take away medication, they will go back to that. And those are the reflexes that can stay active for many, many years. And that's something we have to bear in mind as well. Because it's like the elephant in the room. Huh? It's always there. You never say their name, but it is always there. So better not medication. Well, of course, medication can help and does help. Okay, let's go on. You said that the sympathetic activity regulates the cardiac, skeletal, and arterial muscles. Balancing with Nesa, the autonomic nervous system, can we improve the contractibility and that muscle tone? Well, my answer is yes. And what program do you use? Well, that's the key. Many of them, all of them, really. As Raquel said at the beginning, there are many different programs, many different protocols, but then you analyze what works better, and that's it. There are many solutions, but when we start or when we think about lowering the sympathetic, we increase the parasympathetic system. We can go through different reasonings, but I use a lot number 7. Treatment number 7, increase of sympathetic activity. The parasympathetic goes down, and those neural networks are global. So I need to have a global approach, and then I go in with program number 7, always with 7. Thanks very much. I don't know if you can enable the microphone because Fabiola wants to contribute something. Thank you very much, Nelson, for dear colleague, for your contribution. I wanted to contribute something about the apnea. In clinical terms, we differentiate between central apnea and obstructive apnea. And we've seen good results in central apnea, not so much in obstructive apnea. Yeah, no, thanks very much for your clarification. Thank you. Do you feel that neuromodulation can be another instrument, like, for example, ischemic compression? What advantages might it have, in your opinion? Sorry? Can you repeat the question? Okay, I'll repeat. Do you feel that neuromodulation, non-invasive neuromodulation by Nesa can be an instrument, another instrument, like, for example, ischemic compression? What are the advantages of this system? I think that they refer to the fact that this is a supplement for this whole treatment at muscle level. But there are therapies arterial occlusion therapies, and those can be used as well. And so they will help this therapy. But we modulate the sympathetic and the direct activity through the arteries, and we reduce the blood pressure. So that's a sympathetic activity that will increase the pressure on arterial circulation. And we also are going to change that, and we are going to change also the fact that it is the ischemia on the muscle that we are going to analyze. So we have two ways or two paths to modulate. Last question, Nelson. You can breathe now. So that's a lower muscle reflex. Last question. I think that we have already answered this, but can you clarify? Can we modulate central alterations from this neuromuscle center? Yes, that's what I do on a daily basis. You change one part and you have an impact on the whole. That's always like that. If you touch a point, the brain will make you modulate. So we are modifying the muscle tone of the muscle, and then the brain perhaps do not feel it, but it knows. It knows, and those are the systems that are going to regulate that information that is going to be linked to the brain. Okay, so yes, it is possible. If we modulate one part, you modulate everything, and if you modulate the whole, you modulate also the part. Thanks very much, Nelson. You can close your presentation. Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's extremely important. Knowledge is extremely important. Knowledge sets us free. You shouldn't fear anything in life. Just understand through knowledge. And that's what we are doing today. Thanks very much.